So many thanks. That was absolutely wonderful, and in fact you gave me some very lovely thoughts in terms of that balance between the kind of collection focus and the context focus. And I hope that I can situate what I'm going to talk about today within that kind of median line between those two. And I think that's where what we would hope to be doing in terms of this exhibition, in terms of both the National Museum but in a broader European context, that we somehow fit in within that frame that you so brilliantly illustrated for us, and equally in that terms of engaging with the community. But I should also say I was absolutely delighted and really thrilled with this wonderful invitation from Professor Kelleher, and delighted to be here to speak to you today, or to address such an audience with so much expertise. And in many respects, I'm working together from UCD. Perhaps my role is knowledge transfer. I was trying to cite where I am within a structured framework program, but also working very closely with the National Museum. And what I wanted to do, it's a little bit like moving from analog to digital in a way, because we worked together on a previous exhibition which actually forms the basis in many respects for what's to come. So I will sort of sketch what we have done and then some of this work in progress, and really in a way to elaborate on some of the local maybe collections and some of that local material. And indeed it would be wonderful. We do have some very good bog bodies on display, and in fact I'm going to show you some Viking pieces in a moment, because we are very closely connected, as you know. So in many respects, I also, lastly, there were so many wonderful thoughts in the room from this morning, but that whole idea of creativity and the boundaries and that kind of blurring from, where things arise from. So hopefully we can capture some of that today. So in terms of that blurring and between the metaphysical or the physical presence, Leopold Bloom, and I wanted to start with, this is James Augustine Joyce's classroom, which is upstairs, and some of you may or may know this room. It's 85, and he certainly was here between 1899 and 1902, and it's a wonderful small room. It's a little difficult to see, but the furniture is as it actually was, and I don't know of many spaces like that. But Leopold Bloom then, who is familiar to, I'm sure, most and many of us, he crossed over Kildare Street and stepped into the National Museum to avoid meeting Blazes Boylan. And that in itself, he sought refuge up the steps and into the hallowed portico of the National Museum. And Joyce describes it in a well-known quotation. He said it was a long entranceway. And in fact, you do wind through the wonderful railings, and we heard about railings earlier in terms of Trinity. So you step out from the street and into this kind of hallowed area of the museum. And it seems fitting to connect the Ulysses Centre, Joyce's classroom, and our National Museum, both then and now. And as in fact the National Museum had only recently opened its doors on August 29, 1890, and I show you here two images, and it would have been this that Leopold Bloom metaphysically, I suppose, saw as he crossed the threshold. But also in Ulysses, there is this wonderful description of how his mind was distracted off the Blazes Boylan encounter and he describes the shapely goddesses Venus and Juno, curves the world admires. But actually what we should know, and what we know a little more resulting from our exhibition, the first Roman collection and investigations that we put on display more recently, were that many of those were in fact casts. So we didn't necessarily have, when we didn't have the Venus and the Juno, we procured casts of those. So that would have been very much what he saw. And also to note, so while we can reconstruct perhaps in our mind's eye what Bloom, or indeed Joyce, would have viewed and seen inside the museum, there was indeed a Roman collection and a smaller collection of Etruscan and Byzantine antiquities, which were presented on that day, together with other and many of the museum's Irish antiquities, indeed French, Cypriot, Persian, and in fact capturing very much what we perhaps now consider the Universal Museum, maybe I'm blurring the lines a little bit in terms of recent museum theories, but in any case, the mandate of the museum on the day it opens its doors was that it was intended to be viewed by so large a proportion of the population as have never had opportunities of seeing artistic and or scientific collections. So that in itself was setting up a public museum for the society to view objects and artifacts that it wouldn't otherwise have a chance to see. So the collection then, and in terms of the research that we and I very much was involved in, it came from the Royal Dublin Society, and much of this is published, but also we took time to try and identify where the various objects came from. There was also a modest collection in Trinity College, and there was a building constructed for it. And this is very much also present these days, this recent trend in building new museum buildings to house collections, and that in itself, there's a new and great, or not, a recent debate in terms of the architecture very much superseding or overshadowing the collections inside. But for our purposes, what we should note is that there was a competition, a public architecture competition. It was won by Thomas Newnham Dean and his son, Manly Dean, and they were part of Dean and Woodward, the great architectural consortium, if you like, who at the same time as they were building the museum building were also finishing the museum building at Trinity, which is a completely different style in terms of Ruscinian Gothic. This is very much more, if you can call these things, Victorian Palladian style. And in fact, it has been likened to, we spoke about the Pergamon Altes Museum a little earlier, which was designed by Carl Schinkel in the 1820s. So in any respect, there were neoclassical influences in the building, and both the generous central hallway was commented on, and something I'll refer to a little later by Walter Strickland from the 1920s. He makes reference to this great hall. The rotunda, where that Venus and Juno figure from Ulysses was made of classical columns underneath this generous, wonderful, the great cupola, modelled on the Pantheon in Rome, it was suggested, and it was made of marble, which was quarried from the counties of Cork, Kilkenny, Galway, Limerick, and Armagh to mirror the entrance. So it had various and important undertones linking the materials to the country and to the resources, the natural resources at the time. So I want to introduce this short talk today very much by explaining my involvement with the National Museum, very much at that time in preparation of a catalogue on this material, Roman material, which had been consigned to state storage during the early years of the foundation of the state. So this was its next iteration, if you like, and we put together a Roman life exhibition, which I suppose in many respects is the analogue of the next CEMEC digital, which is forthcoming. So in many ways, the Roman collection is at the heart of the museum collection, and indeed these are a little dark to see, but what we do now have is also the new treasury collection, which has been reworked and revisited, and it's very much out of this that our CEMEC exhibition is coming from, where we're working from. So linking the Roman and the early medieval through memories of Rome. But coming and returning and just staying with the first, this Roman life exhibition, it was very clear quite quickly this was the kernel of the museum's collection. And since 1815 it had been part of Leinster House. Laterally then Royal Irish Academy became part of the collection, and in fact the Royal Dublin Society, part of that Leinster House, was given over to housing the collections from the Royal Dublin Society. And again, to emphasise, under the Museums Act, under the management of the Department of Science and Art, South Kensington, during the course of the 19th century, it became to be publicly managed. And this was the important or significant point, bending from our earlier talk, that these objects were acquired for public ownership and permanent exhibition as part of the new museum. And this key development also, we should trace it back to a process, if you like, of the public exhibition of antiquities, which begins in Cork in 1852 and also in Dublin in 1853, which they follow from maybe spurs or inspiration from the great exhibition that we know of in 1851 from London. And the success of those had the effect of galvanising this great Victorian interest in exhibiting. And we have the establishment of the Royal Irish Institute of Science and Art, which had its principal aim in the creation of a permanent public exhibition. And the foundation stone, as I say, then later laid for the museum 1885. So in fact, it was its founders their aim was to create a common unified exhibition which extended to Irish and European art, but also covered the general periods, and this is written into the founding mandate, the general periods of Greek Cypriot, Roman, Persian, Indian, English and French culture and civilization. So a great umbrella, if you like. And as originally conceived, the classical casts were also exhibited alongside the ground floor galleries, which we've just seen, Celtic crosses, medieval fabrics, Gothic portals, Romanesque arches, and other examples of Renaissance sculpture. So in a way, these Greek and Roman antiquities were very much part of this, but it was also extended to examples of Indian Persian art, as well as Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities. So this is where I'm suggesting the roots of this notion of the kind of universal museum maybe coming through. And then Walter Strickland, from slightly later 1920s, he described the arrangement as connected to the drawing school. He said it was very complete, particularly the bust gallery, the exhibition rooms, and he described the long room, which is the present Great Hall in the museum, as he said, when we compare it to the next to the Louvre, he said it's perhaps the finest exhibition room in Europe. So he's setting his sights very high. But he also said it contained an upright lantern in the centre of the ceiling, which terminates in a stucco, in this iron and stucco cornice, and also he goes on to describe numbers of the busts in the gallery. So we have two, at least, ideas of what it once looked like, and then the obvious photographs of the day give us some idea of that view, that the great idea of Leopold and indeed James Joyce, what they saw when they crossed the threshold. In any case, also another visual that does and has become apparent also out of this research was one of the very earliest museum catalogues, I think, that I know of anywhere. And it's 1810. Again, a young Irish naturalist who drew what he saw on display, both from the RDS and the Trinity College collections, which we then laterally found the artefacts, this piece of small piece of Roman mosaic, and incorporated those into the display of the Roman Life exhibition. And Digby's work was recently auctioned and bought. It's in the Library of New South Wales. So I'm very grateful to them for allowing me use the images, that one that you see on the screen. But it also serves to demonstrate that he's depicting a kind of camera of curiosities, almost a varied collection from rings to an ethnographic staff from the South Seas, Pacific, and a Roman mosaic detail there. So this broad and unified approach was very much in keeping with the measures taken by the central level of central government to coordinate the assembly of this museum collections in the provincial museums of both Britain and Ireland at this time. So it's also of significance that when they, to in fact simply fill the gaps, they commissioned selections of plaster and bronze casts. And there's someone here, Michael Ann here today, is working very hard on a PhD subject to fill those gaps now further in terms of the commissioning of the casts and then how that related to the collection in more detail. In any case, very quickly, the exhibition, which was actually dismantled in 2011 in spite of having very high visitor numbers, and in fact we, rather like our science museum, rather than infantilizing, I liked his choice of words, this collection of Roman material. We wanted to very much stimulate young adults and looked to the school curriculum. It was thematic. We had very small space. We used 5 cases, and we ranged it across the collection with the varied casts that survived from metal to paste gems, to then mixing that with the antiquities themselves. And the themes, again, very quickly, thematically, from everyday life to death, burial, and the afterlife. These fitted in with the school curriculum: religion, personal adornment, and dress. And some cases seem to be more curious to students than others, and things like, what people wore, how they entertained themselves, and imperial power. All of these has, held particular interest for students, and it ties in very much with our school curriculum in the 5th and 6th years of classical studies. So in a way it served its purpose, and there is a plan. We also illustrated some of the further Roman trading presences with some of the objects that came from further afield, such as the Gandharan Buddhas, and also, more significantly from the Irish perspective, we included Romano-British artefacts, which very much found in Ireland, including some hack silver and some various Roman coins and so on. So it's that which forms the connection with our new CEMEC project, which focuses on memory of Rome as an initial theme. So we're able to kind of bridge the gap between this and what's to come. So just a view of those cases with the all-important timeline and the various other details. So mixing very simple media, as I say, from the analog to the digital, we didn't have screens or any interpretive detailing. It was very much objects with panels, and the timeline held the essence of what we were doing together. And the catalogue was an important source of information with it, highlighting the kind of aesthetic but also art historical merit of the objects in the collection, but also placing them in this context of the Roman world, and bringing much pleasure, I hope. And certainly our students were very disappointed when it was taken down, but there is a plan to reconstruct that exhibition together with some of the Greek material in a new iteration, let's say, in one of the upper rooms very soon. But pressures of space and time, and as we know, it led to the moving of that out, and in came Brian Baru last year, the year before. So the new European project, of which I'm also involved very much, is the CEMEC. CEMEC's short for Connecting Early Medieval European Collections. It involves, very simply, our postdoc, the museum, wonderful. These are wonderful, everybody working together, Maeve Sikora from the National Museum. There's a photographic assistant, also the keeper is vital, and indeed then the project itself. So these are just some very simple ideas to put together our visual content, the objects. Ultimately, it involves 12 other groups. In total, we're 12. With 10 European partners. It's directed from the Allard Pearson Museum in Amsterdam, but it involves colleagues from Bonn, from the Byzantine Christian Museum in Athens, from the Research Centre in Rome, Iberian Centre of Archaeology in Jaén, ourselves, and the National Museum, in fact the Swedish Museum, Historical Museum in Stockholm, and the Ashmolean in Oxford are some of the group. But essentially putting together and linking through using the existing information and pulling forward for us the project. Ultimately, it will create a mobile virtual exhibition. So using and in fact working on the 3D, using many of the new tools available, such as 3D scanning too. And it's difficult, we're working on the difficulties, for example, of 3D scanning shiny objects. So that's something new that we're working very closely with. The Discovery Programme here also in Dublin has formed a part of this, and they're working to take down the sheen. The difficulty is 3D scanning works very well, it seems, with stone and objects such as that, whereas the shinier ones are slightly more difficult. But in a sense, it's comforting to know there's 7 museums, 4 technical partners, and 7 associate partners, and we're all coming up with the same difficulties. So we have various meetings to knowledge exchange, if you like, and what it ultimately also importantly forms is a collaborative network of exchange in the museum context. And that's very significant in this, as you mentioned, in these times of sort of great austerity. So UCD working very actively with the museum here as a collaborator. And it's the knowledge exchange that's crucial in terms of early medieval heritage. And there's a number of meetings for test beds. There's a number of the various mobile groups moving between each of the partners. And ultimately, it will result in this transnational panoramic exhibition, which has a generic curatorial content. And there are 4 real exhibitions that are of 4 collections, which will go together with this. So it'll be a kind of moving circus in a funny way for a period of time. But essentially, it's looking at new ways of digital data acquisition. We're also sharing digital content on these objects, and it's an essentially, from the Irish perspective, I suppose in a way aiming to reach new audiences, but also addressing the many problems that we have within, we're not just here, but very maybe more isolated collections, small groups. How do you convey regional developments, and it's that innovative use of, I suppose, technology that we aim to tackle this problem. So in terms of academic interest, but also for the museum and archives, there's a kind of collaborative business plan, and ultimately aiming to attract, again, the audience. Who this is for is always in our mind's eye, to improve visitor experience and so on. To get that balance between, the content and the context, as you very rightly say. Also, without giving too much away, and very quickly, you've been looking for a while at 2 of our gold pendants, which were redeposited. These are solidi from a period of Constantine. They were redeposited at Newgrange in the 4th century AD. So memories of Rome, very significant in terms of one of our themes. Some of the other objects that we're pulling to the fore, it's Ireland's unbroken Celtic heritage, if you like, from the Roman era, even beforehand, the Iron Age and Latin art, mixed with Germanic traditions through the missionary contact of Irish Christian missionaries with Anglo-Saxon in England. It creates this, what is often described as Hiberno-Saxon or insular art, one of those thematic terms themselves that people endlessly discuss. But so what we're recognising is a golden age of Irish art. So in that regard, we're looking at, further down to, for example, this is a stone villa from Irish in Kerry, 5th, 6th century, and it's inscribed, and it's this interest in literacy as a very significant part of the thematic material. I'll just go back, and we have as our centrepiece in the Irish connection that the early Christians championed the Codex, of course, over the papyrus scroll, and the art of the book obviously develops. But the recent discovery of the Fadden Moor manuscript is forming the centrepiece of our exhibit. So it's absolutely going to be the highlight. And while it's now has just gone on display in the new Treasury buildings, the new Treasury exhibition in our National Museum, this will form the centrepiece of the Irish contribution. And in both directions, while we have, we're very keen to display our Irish craftsmen, the brilliant kind of harmonious ornamental patterns which come from the various objects, such as the Great Ardor Chalice or some of these. But it's the other, the more lateral objects that we don't often, we see them in smaller trays, or they're not often highlighted. So moving from the great hierarchy of the iconic objects to the lower levels, and the social structures are important. And this is a bone piece, and some of this is trial work for what will later become very much our Ernest style design. A wonderful, very completely hidden but recently discovered stone reliquary from Dromiskin in County Louth is part of the funerary culture, while we also have magic and religion as another theme, and bone plaque on a linen string. We have also crossing over the gender divide from the Viking period, this wonderful silk headscarf. And this has just been the subject of recent studies. So we're looking more towards objects that aren't necessarily in the direct firing line. And lastly, in collaboration with Discovery, they've been working very much on 3D Icons project and have been scanning in 3D some of our larger monuments. So we will also draw in and draw on, and in agreement with them, the high crosses that they've been scanning, and also this is the Skellig Michael Cemetery. So pulling together in a new fashion, weaving or interweaving our Irish narrative and traditions in a digital display of objects, forming a kind of digital core panorama, if you like, as a backdrop to 4 central collection displays right across. And those central sites are Bonn, Athens, Rome and Amsterdam. So we will be very much connected as part of that. So that's in essence, I can't tell you more because we've only really begun the project, and at this moment we're selecting the objects, selecting the images, what is useful, and increasingly coming up with more interesting, often hidden objects, and trying to weave into that the context in terms of the content, as well as what will really shine a light in many respects on some of the Irish art. And it's always there's an overlay of a narrative, so it's both vertical and horizontal. While the budget in terms of human resources is high, we also will be evaluating as we go. So essentially the making of these 4 national and then 3 transnational exhibitions will be displayed in 2018. And in fact, I shouldn't but to emphasise that part of the project, there is a transnational meeting here in this room, I hope, on the 20th and 21st of April in 2017, to which, as European participants, you would all be very, very much welcome and invited. And I'll be hoping to invite you all to this workshop as part of the wider network, and in terms of both the digital and the virtual heritage networks in Ireland, to bring us together and to attempt to close some of this knowledge gap that we've talked about, and indeed engage further and think of ways of engaging further with the community. So I'm going to leave it there, but I hope in a way to try and attempt to demonstrate a more local level of creativity, inputting it into a broader the collections context in early medieval Europe, if you like, and just the workings within a museum context itself. So thank you.